All right. Welcome, everybody, to another special edition of the Long Winded One podcast. I have a very special guest tonight. And normally, when I do this kind of an interview, it's to learn all about this particular person. But I can tell you that I have listened to several very, very interesting podcast episodes about this person, and I will point you in that direction here as we meet him. Let me start by saying welcome to Dr. Andrew Higgins. He is an expert in the interrelation between myth and language in some of Tolkien's earliest writings. He's the co-editor of a book that I've already talked about on this podcast called A Secret Vice, which he worked on with Dr. Dimitra Fimi. And this was about Tolkien's created languages, which won the 2017 Tolkien Society Award for Best Book. He's a current board member at Signum University. And finally, he's just a very, very active writer and speaker in the Tolkien community, and just generally a really nice guy. So, Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here. Wow, I've been really enjoying your podcast, so I'm very excited to be on this.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to point the listeners. I think I've listened to at least two of your interviews on the Prancing Pony podcast. Yeah. You had one in January on the Tolkien Experience podcast, which is very good. And I re-listened to that, believe it or not, right before I talked to you. And so I don't want to repeat any of the things that they did in January on there, but we are going to piggyback on some of those things. I asked you to come on the podcast because I had come across your blog. Which I will list in in some of the notes here, so people can find your blog. But I noticed that you had taken a couple of trips, day trips to places that were sort of core to the formation of some of Tolkien's earliest tales, and we're talking about the sort of the Book of Lost Tales. And I don't know if you know this, but we're in the middle of kind of a special Tolkien pilgrimage, which has turned virtual after the coronavirus. I just recorded one with Mary in Birmingham. We're going to do one of Oxford and Cheddar Gorge, and I'm just really excited to have you here after reading your blog posts about your trips to Warwick and to Great Haywood. And so we're going to be sort of traveling into the past, into the sort of very early legendarium, back in around the time of like 1915 to 1917, as we talk about this.
I mean, the blog was actually quite interesting because when I moved here to the UK, because obviously from my accent you can tell I'm not from these parts. I started keeping that blog because I really wanted to start exploring some key things about Tolkien and especially Tolkien's languages. And there was some really nice serendipity that happened because as I was keeping that blog and taking those trips, and I was still pretty much a new tourist in England in a way because I'd only been here a couple of years. I also started taking these amazing courses on Tolkien and fantasy literature with Dr. Dimitra Fimi when she was at Cardiff Metropolitan. And it was through that I got to meet Dr. Fimi. And it was through that Dr. Fimi encouraged me to do some serious work on Tolkien. And that eventually became working on a PhD with her. And I had a full-time job at the time. I was the director of fundraising at Glyndebourne Opera. And I thought, how am I going to do this? I said, well, you'd be doing Tolkien stuff anyway, so why don't you do it seriously? And so I started working with Dr. Fimi on my thesis, which eventually became this exploration of looking at the intertwined role of myth and language invention in the earliest version of the mythology. And I chose the earliest version of the mythology because I really felt there had been so much done on The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and even the Silmarillion. And what Christopher Tolkien had given us was this incredible gift of his father's, the history of Middle-earth. And I really wanted to dig into that very, very early version of the mythology and the language invention. And so that kind of all came together as I was taking these wonderful trips to Warwick and up to what would be Tabrabell, basically. And when I went to, and the other thing that I found very interesting, and I found very early on in one of the Parma Elder Limbarons, which are these language journals that the Elvish Fellowship, Linguistic Fellowship, published of Tolkien's language papers, because basically when Tolkien died, he left a lot of language papers, and Christopher did a wonderful job of publishing a lot of it, but he also realized that he was not so well equipped to publish all the very detailed stuff about the language, because Tolkien, as we know, was very interested in the idea of the development and progressions of languages. And because he was a philologist himself, he would change a lot of that as he went on. So we have over 3,000 pages of this language. And this has all started to be published in Parma Elder Lambaron and Vinyard Tangwar, these two journals. And in one of the Parmas, there was this wonderful, this little sketch on a piece of paper. Well, I didn't know it was on a piece of paper then. I just saw it printed in the thing, of these three heraldic devices that Tolkien sketched in about 1917 when he was developing his Gnomish language, which was the language for the Noldoli. And it depicted three places. One was Tavrabel, one was Cortirion, and the other one was a place called Kelbaros. And he had little drawings next to it, and I think we'll get you an image of it. And when I went to Warwick Castle, which of course is Cortirion in the mythology, because let's remember when Tolkien started inventing, the whole impetus behind it, as he said in a letter to Milton Waldman, is he wanted to create a mythology for the English, because he felt that, the English did not have a mythology, that it had all been basically kind of taken over by the Normans in 1066 and all that. And so he started creating a mythology where the world he was inventing was a form of England in an older time, basically. And it was through that Ariel would come to the island of the elves and hear the lost tales, etc., etc. And so in the early versions of the mythology and in the lexicons of the names he invented, key places in what would become England were actually places in his mythology. And Cortirion was Warwick. And he actually created a whole, Tolkien being the philologist that he was, created a whole linguistic mapping of how Cortirion actually became Warwick later on. And in the little heraldic device for Cortirion, he actually drew a little peacock underneath two towers. And when I went to Warwick, lo and behold, when I got to Warwick Castle, there in front of me were two peacocks pacing a stately drill, just like Tolkien said in his poem Cortirion Among the Trees. So I really felt like when I went to Warwick that I was at the place where, Ariel came to hear the tale. So that really excited me, and I did a blog post about that, which you saw. And then a couple of years later, I went up further north, and I went to Great Haywood in Staffordshire. And there, and that's, of course, the place where Tolkien and Edith, after Tolkien came out of World War I and was recuperating, he stayed in Great Haywood, and that's where a lot of the Book of Lost Tales was written. And of course, he describes the Grey Bridge of Tavrabel. Well, sure enough, when you go to Great Haywood, there is a Grey Bridge.
Yeah.
And there's also a wonderful multi-chimney house called Shugborough Estate. And as Tom Shippey has pointed out, Shugborough, that Shug part of it, is actually Sukka, which means a demon or a spirit or a fairy. So this is literally the borough of fairies. And of course, in the Book of Lost Tales, this is Gilfanin's house that Ariel goes to. So I was literally seeing the geography of the world building Tolkien was doing of the Book of Lost Tales in all of these visits. So it was very exciting. The third part of the heraldic device, Kelbaros, is kind of depicted with a little fountain and a tree. And I actually done a paper on this in one of the Kalamazoo conferences. And that's actually Cheltenham. And of course, the importance of Cheltenham to Tolkien is that's where, when he was 21 years old, he went down there and convinced Edith, who was engaged to another person named George Field. I always feel sorry for poor George Field.
Yeah.
But in a day, he convinced her to marry him.
Yeah.
And in that heraldic device, there are actually two rings entwined, and in Gnomish it says "reunited again." So in these three devices, we actually see the kind of the life of Tolkien and Edith in that very early period when he was writing the Book of Lost Tales.
Oh
So
wow,
that was very exciting.
that's incredible. Well, we're gonna look at. Is it okay if we look at some of the pictures from Warwick?
Yeah, let's go.
All right. So right now we're doing a flyover of Warwick Castle,
Hmm.
and I know. So for us in the campaign, we part two, which was called Rise of the Mormogil. The characters come into the sort of Avalone in Erisea, and then they travel through the land of elms, and they come to the Cottage of Lost Play, and eventually they go to the House of Hundred Chimneys. But before that, they also stopped by Cortirian. And I remember in researching that, the thing that really stood out to me about Cortirian was sort of the gray brick in the towers, right? And that's how I
Mm.
described it to the players. And is it okay if I read a small section from the
Yeah,
Cortirian poem? Yeah. So this
yeah.
was let's see here. Let's see. Oh, ancient city on a leaguered hill, old shadows linger in your broken gate. Your stones are gray, your old halls are now still, your towers silent on the mist await. And so now this was a poem that maybe you can tell us a little bit more about it.
Yeah.
Even so, this was gosh, Warwick, Warwick, we're talking about core or Courtiering among the trees is the name of the poem, and we're talking. He wrote that in what 1915.
November 1915. Yeah. And it really, and you also mentioned a lovely word, which is al minore, which is the land of the elms. And I just love the phono aesthetics of that, just the way, and of course that's an example of the earliest version of what was called Kenya, which would become Quenya, basically, of that idea. And there's this wonderful lexicon that he kept of words that he was inventing at that time, called the Quenya Quetzal, or the Quenya lexicon.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the earliest version we have of the Elvish language. And you find in there, it says Al Minore, Warwick, district of the elms. So he actually puts the name Warwick in there,
Hmm.
basically. So yeah, he so identified these places. And when you read that poem and you look at Warwick Castle, you can see where it's coming from, basically. And of course, he spent a lot of time in Warwick visiting Edith as well. So he was there a lot, basically.
And we know that this is actually where they were married, just
Yep.
just down the street at the Catholic Church.
Yep.
So can you for I wanted to see this so much firsthand, and I still plan to go there someday. But
You'll get there.
can you describe it? I mean, can you for the listener? Can you, as you're approaching the sort of the front gate and towers are looming over you? Can you describe sort of the feeling that you had when you first got there?
Yeah, you go up a very steep hill. I remember that. It's about 4 or 5 blocks from the train station because we went by train.
Mm-hmm.
And you go up a very steep hill and you come upon this gate, basically. And then you can see the tower, just like he describes the tower.
Yeah.
The tower is right there. And then there's a kind of green underneath. And that's where I saw the peacocks. And literally, if you read through that poem, I think it's, yeah, here we go. O spiry town upon a windy hill, with sudden winding alleys, shady walled, where even now the peacocks pace a stately drill, majestic, saffron, and emerald.
Oh
So
wow!
they're right there waiting for you when you come to Warwick Castle.
You did a much better job reading the poetry than I did. Oh well, someday I will get there, I'm sure. So let's see here. Our characters when they went to Cortirian, I remember researching first. I got confused because I realized that in Valinor, or just outside, sort of near the Path of Light, there's a town. Yeah, there's a town called Tirion there, which is sort of the home of the Noldor, right?
Tirion upon Tuna.
Exactly, yeah. And so I was confused at first, which was like where Tyrion was. Is this a different Tyrion? It is, of course. And they met a character named Merrill, who was the Lady of Erisea. Yeah.
And it's interesting because in a way, Cortirion, and I think Tolkien, you can see this all through. Cortirion is kind of a reflection of Tirion upon Tuna, just like later Minas Tirith will be a reflection of Gondor. So and there's that thing that there's that wonderful concept that Berlin Flieger talks about the refraction of things as they get further away from the source, they become less and less and less, and that's what you see. It's a remembrance of Tirion upon Puna, basically.
Right.
And then you have Port Tirion, and then you have Gondolin, and then you have Minas Tirith, etc. So there's that kind of the progression of the refraction of light, basically, that idea. So yeah, so the elves built Tirion as a remembrance of Tirion upon Puna.
Very good. That's awesome. Well, so do you want to? Should we progress into?
Yeah, let's
Stafford?
progress. I love this.
All right, cool.
More than I've seen in the last 4 months, let me tell
you. So we're going to travel from Warwick up to Stafford into Great Haywood. And there are a few places I want to talk about there. And so I guess we're moving. So for you, your trip to Great Haywood would have come about in 2011.
Yeah.
And again, this is where Edith would have been living. She moved there in, I think, April of 1916, if I'm getting my dates correct.
That's right. And isn't Cannock Chase by there, where Tolkien was in? He was in training, basically. He was in training for. Oh, that's Shugborough Hall.
That's right. Yeah. So this will be the first place that we visit, and it's fitting, I think, because for our characters, one of the next places that they visited after Court Tirion, they went over to see Gilfanon in the House of 100 Chimneys, and this is as you mentioned, Shugborough Hall, and I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about this, if you don't mind.
Well, I mean, the first thing when I got there, I looked immediately to see how many chimneys were on the roof. I remember, and there definitely aren't 100. But what's most interesting is in the garden, there's some really interesting little follies, which are these kind of just like buildings and stuff. And there was this one really interesting one that had a kind of a painting on it with Et in Arcadia Ego on it, which I thought was interesting, which is a kind of mystical thing. It's actually owned by a family that allows you to tour it and stuff, and some of the art inside was beautiful. But I didn't see a lot of chimneys. So, I mean, again, I think it might have been the type of thing that Tolkien looked at and said, yeah, that's interesting as part of an inspiration for it or something. But I think the bridge is a lot more. We'll get to the bridge, but I think the bridge has a lot more foundation in something Tolkien really would have been inspired in.
Sure.
But
well,
the fact that it's called Shugborough Hall and the fact that means Shug Sucka, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Essex Bridge is actually not too far. It's just like I don't know. It's not a block. I'm thinking in terms of a city, but it's just
fairly
down the
close.
road.
We walked it. I walked it. I remember. Yeah.
So here we go. We're doing a flyover. Here's the bridge. It's actually a really interesting shape, and we'll go right to the picture of that. Let's see here. Here we go. Essex Bridge. Here it is.
That's it. And it was built in Elizabethan times. And the river that goes under it. So in the little heraldic device of Tol Erithrin, Tolkien sketched the bridge, and he has two rivers going over it called the Gir and the Afros. And you see the little trees in the background. He's got an elm and something else. So it's fairly close. And then, of course, later on, I think in 1918, I think that's right, somewhere around there, he wrote a poem called The Grey Bridge of Cavervell, where the elves go marching out and everything like that. And that is definitely, the bridge. And it would have been during the winter when Tolkien wrote that. And of course, Grey Bridge, I think that's definitely an inspiration. So when I was standing on that bridge, I really felt like this is the Great Bridge of Cavervell.
Oh,
this is just what Tolkien was talking about.
Amazing. And, for us, Cavervell was where, the characters got their kind of one of their first glimpses of Aman and into, to stare into the tuna, maybe. The path of light, the pass of light. Um, so this is Tavrobel. So
Yeah.
there is another notable location which I'm sure you'll mention. It's kind of we're not really sure if this was an actual location or if it was some sort of inspiration, but this is Rock Cottage, and
Yeah.
this is where we know the Tolkiens lived when I think he was recovering from trench fever in 1916.
Hmm.
But it's just across the bridge over a few blocks, and we'll have a picture of this. And this was actually recently in the news because it was just sold, I believe.
Yeah.
Here's a picture of Rock Cottage. Now, what do we know about this? You mentioned this
Well,
in your blog.
we know that he sketched it, and I think it appears in Wayne Hammond and Christina Stoll's book on Tolkien's art. Um, I don't know. I mean, for me, did that inspire the Cottage of Lost Play? He also sketched some other cottages, like in Warwick and other places that might have inspired it. And of course, the idea of the cottage that is bigger on the outside than on the inside. That, which of course echoes another mythos that Time Lord magic. I, yeah, I mean, you could find that in the stories of Cuchulainn. I mean, I don't know if that so much inspired him, basically, but yeah, he definitely did sketch that, and that
Nice.
is where Edith stayed, and he stayed. Yeah.
And for the listeners, the Cottage of Lost Play is where Ariel and our characters met Lindo and Vare and Little Heart the Gong Warden, where Tom, the mallet of the characters had to find the mallet of Tombo in order to play the last music of the Ainur after the Dagger Daggerath. Tom, in our story.
So did your characters have to get small? Have to get small to go in, like Ariel does?
No, well, we talked a little bit about sort of the size thing, but we also there was a kind of like a flashback scene where, and I talked a little bit about this with Verlin Flieger about how time was kind of when you travel the path of dreams, time is kind of the Elore Male, time is kind of wonky. So one of the characters saw himself in the cottage as a child.
Ooh.
And so, yeah, that was a kind of a cool moment. But I loved the Cottage of Lost Play and all of
Yeah.
that. Well, okay.
Well, you talk to the master scholar on Tolkien and time, because Verlin Flieger's written the definitive, book Question of Time, which looks at the whole idea of how time works.
Yeah.
In Tolkien's work, and yeah, it's very interesting.
Well, Verlin's the one that convinced me that if I were to pursue a further degree in Tolkien studies, that I would look at sort of his time travel unfinished works and how sort of the Elore Male, like that idea was in his head, the idea that you can pass on experience and memory, like have this shared memory with people that have lived before. That was clear in a lot of his writings. So that's where I would study. That's where I would go deeper.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, Notion Club and Lost Road. Definitely. There's a lot of work done there on those two. Yeah.
Well, Andy, this is great. This has been really fantastic, and
cool. It's been fun.
When I get there, I'm gonna know so much more about this, and I'm gonna be able to orient myself, and I hope our listeners will be able to do that as well. But if I could I switch gears a little bit and
sure.
and ask you some questions about you?
Yeah.
So we just traveled with you. We did a virtual travel sort of tour of some places in the Book of Lost Tales. And you talked a lot about language, and of course, I've talked a lot about your book on language. But I'm curious: have you ever developed any of your own languages?
Yes, I have, and it's sitting in a drawer right over here in this room, and it's got the Tolkienian name of Legendarium, which is a problem already. But I started inventing languages. My secret vice started when I was about 13 years old, and I've been working on it ever since, on and off. I had a great when I was actually working on the book of Mitra. I started really getting involved with it. And I actually started blogging and talking on Tumblr with David Peterson, who is the inventor of Dothraki and High Valyrian and
Oh wow.
languages like that. And I was actually trying out some stuff on him, which was really cool. And yeah, I work on it. I mean, the thing with it's what is your objective in doing language invention? You know, what I did it because I wanted to understand kind of the way Tolkien thought in a way about language invention. So that's kind of how I started it.
Hmm.
And it was very Tolkienian when I first did it. It's less Tolkienian now. But you need a lot of time. It could become all, you know, as you know, Tolkien found. You know, you could spend hours just, you know, structuring what the ablative absolute should be, or you know, what a new noun class should be, or something like that. And of course, as with Tolkien, it breeded a mythology of its own. And I have hidden away sketches of mythologies and things like that. So yeah, and it's something I take out every once in a while and do a bit of work on and stuff.
Well, I hope someday we'll get to see this.
Oh, I don't know. I think
So let's transition here. So you mentioned on the Tolkien Experience podcast, you mentioned at the time back in January that you were getting ready to start a new job. I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit about this new job?
Yeah, sure. Well, yes. After about being in opera, I've been in opera for about 20 years, doing fundraising and a bit of marketing and press at one point. And I've been at Glyndebourne Opera, which is an opera. It's primarily a festival, but it's also more than that, down in Sussex. I did that for 11 years and had an amazing time. And I just decided I wanted to try something different. And I just happened to get, you know, there was this position at the Imperial War Museums to become director of development. And I love history, and especially when I was doing my thesis, I spent a lot of time there because I was looking at a period in Tolkien's life, you know, during World War One, and you know, I wasn't doing a biographical thesis. I mean, John Garth has done the
Mm-hmm.
definitive work on that. But I was spending a lot of time there trying to absorb what Tolkien would have felt, look at things, and actually, we have his revolver from World War One at the
Oh,
museum, which is really cool. And
yeah.
I go and see it anytime I can. Actually, it's up at IWM. We have 5 venues. So in London, we have our own museum at Lambeth Row. We have Churchill's War Rooms, which are the bunker where Churchill directed most of World War II in Whitehall. We have a warship called the HMS Belfast, which is the only surviving warship from World War II. It
Wow.
also fought in the Korea War. It ran the Arctic convoys for the Soviets.
Wow.
It's a living piece of history. And then we have Duxford in Cambridgeshire, which is an Air Force base where the Battle of Britain flew out of and everything. And then we have a museum in Manchester, and that's where Tolkien's revolver is right now at IWM North. So that became available, and I just went for it, and I got it, and it's an amazing, amazing place, incredible people. And I started in February. I was there for about a month and a half, just starting to get my stride, just getting, you know, meeting my team, trying to work on a strategy, and then boom, Armageddon happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we've been working from home. I think, you know, and everyone's together. We're reopening our venue starting in August, which is really, really exciting. And as a fundraiser, one of the most frustrating things is not being able to meet with people and fundraise, because
Hmm.
a lot of fundraising is about building relationships and getting to know people. So it's been a bit frustrating, but we're getting back, and we're going to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain in September with 3 days of air shows. So all very exciting, and we're opening new galleries for Second World War and Holocaust next year, which are going to be phenomenal. So yeah, it's been an interesting time to start a new job. I wouldn't recommend it,
Yeah.
but it is what it is. And as they say in Lord of the Rings, there's always hope. There's always hope. There's a catastrophe just waiting around the corner. So
Yes, yes, and we have learned about the catastrophe from Verlin Flieger on this podcast.
absolutely. So
Um,
yeah.
well, let's getting back to Tolkien then. Thank you
Mm,
for sharing that. But do you
mm.
have any Tolkien projects coming up that people can be on the lookout for?
Yes, well, the big one that is looming, and I have devoted every Sunday for the last couple of weeks to getting this bloody thing done, is I am working on turning my thesis into a book. And again, and I'm kind of taking the world building kind of structure because I've become very interested in the whole concept of world building and transmedial world building. I've got an article coming out soon in the new volume that Mark Wolf is editing about this American Gothic TV show that I love called Dark Shadows,
Yeah.
which was on TV in the late 60s and 70s, and then has movies and things like that. And so I've taken that kind of approach as saying, and actually Verlin inspired me about this. I heard her give a talk in Oxford when her Kullervo book came out, which is fantastic. And she talked about this being Tolkien's first attempt at world building. This is his first, he's writing the myths, he's creating the maps, he's creating the languages, he's creating all these paratextual things like the heraldic devices of Tol Erithrin. So I'm looking at all of that with a real focus on the early languages. I'm trying to get into the DNA of those languages and also present them in a way that isn't daunting to people. Because I think one of the things about Tolkien's languages, people always feel a bit daunted by all of it,
Yeah. Yeah.
But in many ways, it's just another version of myth making. And, Demetrius pointed this out in some of her works that, within those lexicons, there are myths being born. There are stories being told. And so I don't think you can study Tolkien without studying his languages because, it was so as Verlin Fleege's favorite bumper sticker, mythology is language, language is mythology,
Yeah.
And that is so true for Tolkien. So yeah, I'm hoping to get that done soon. I'm starting to feel. I think I said this on the podcast I did with Sarah. I'm starting to feel like Tolkien must have felt trying to get the Silmarillion done because it's all about getting back into it and setting it up. So now I've become very disciplined. Sunday is devoted to just working on the book.
Very
I
good.
don't read emails. I don't get involved in other projects. I'm trying to relearn Sanskrit and learn Finnish, but not on Sundays, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I've devoted Sunday is to just get it done. And then I think the other thing I'm really interested in, thanks to the, Karl Hofstetter and people like that, we have a lot of these language papers now published. But there's still a lot of contextualization and analysis that needs to be done of them. So I'd like to move away from the earliest period and maybe look at the language work he did when he was in Leeds in the 1920s, and start to look at that and see, he invents Noldorin, which is kind of the next step in Gnomish, for example, and that will then progress to Sindarin later on. And what is he doing with Quenya and all that? So there's a lot more. I mean, you could devote a lifetime to studying Tolkien's language papers, and there's more to come. I mean, they're still publishing papers. There's a lot more to come. So I'll never not have something Tolkienian to do. That's for sure.
Well, if anyone could do it, I think you make the most sense. I mean, you have this great foundation in his early works. So progressing into the 20s, I mean, you have all of that sort of prior knowledge to bring to the table and sort of his next step, right?
Yeah, and there's some great work being done. A wonderful Nelson Gehring, for example, he is a professional philologist, who's done great stuff. James Tauber, for example. So there's a group of us now who are all kind of carrying on the work that was done by the initial group of Karl Hofstetter, who's still doing amazing. Patrick Wynne, people like Arden Smith, people like that who really Christopher entrusted with his father's language papers, and is publishing him in a way that, is presented with notes and editorial comments. It isn't just thrown out there or put on the internet, basically. And that's what we need, basically. So there's a lot of work to be done there, definitely.
Well, after all of these interviews, I come out and I'm so excited for the things that people are talking about, because we always end with like, "Hey, what are you working on? What are you going to come out with next?" So thank you for telling us about that and sharing that with us, and just thank you for being here and making this a rich experience. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's a pleasure. Yeah, and I hope you get over here when all this is over and you can actually see the sights and everything. And
someday, right?
Yeah.
There's always
Brilliant.
hope.